So, for many, the name Edith Nesbit is synonymous with a cycle of adventurous and fantastical Victorian children's fiction, resplendent with flying carpets and phoenixes, with sand fairies and magical castles, or perhaps even treasure seeking or waving down steam engines with petticoats. Perhaps also the name might bring to mind an ardent socialist and political activist who co founded the Fabian Society. But alongside all of this, her impressive career as a writer includes a collection of Gothic short stories, many of which exist within the ubiquitously late Victorian ghost story tradition, and are amongst some of the finest examples of the form, in my opinion. Filled with a characteristic sense of humour and moments of genuine terror, Nesbit's short ghost stories explore contemporary issues traversing gender and the politics of relationships, motherhood, and class. She's enjoying something of a renaissance at the moment, with momentum mounting and her stories being reprinted in collections, whether dedicated to her or amongst other writers. And I think this is a good thing. So, over the next 40 minutes or so, I hope to give an introduction to Nesbit as a writer, thinking about her life a little bit, before giving a countdown of my 5 favourite Nesbit stories for any reader wanting to look beyond Nesbit as a writer of children's fiction and delve deeper into the dark. A quick disclaimer, some of what I'll talk about today is taken straight from my PhD thesis, which is on asexuality through the ghost stories and weird stories of the Fundus Yucks. So those particular stories, the commentary and analysis will have a little bit of an asexual flavour to them. But I hope that's still interesting for you, and I hope that it maybe brings up questions and things you hadn't considered before. So let's get into it. Without further ado, Edith Nesbit, the writer, the activist, and the woman. She was born in South London in 1859, the youngest of 6 children. Her father was the head of an agricultural college, but he died when she was only 4 years old. So a childhood was spent between England and the continent, particularly France and Germany, and this saw Nesbit develop a tomboyish, active personality that would continue into her adulthood. At the age of 18, Edith met Hubert Bland, and by 1880, she was 7 months pregnant with their first child, and they married. This marriage would prove in itself tumultuous. They'd not been married for long before Edith discovered that her new husband was, in fact, already engaged to another woman who had also just had a child by him. The nature of her marriage to Bland, described by critic Patricia Murphy as an utterly bizarre and unconventional marriage to a serial philanderer, is one of the things that has attracted the most critical attention, particularly to biographers. In the introduction to the Penguin edition of Nesbit's horror stories, Naomi Alderman suggests that this might be one of the reasons that her own writing for adults is so effective and affecting. Nesbit had always known that adults could be rapacious, contemptuous, malicious, and sadistic. Her own biography includes an adulterous husband who got one of her dear friends pregnant. She knew about anger, hatred, and sexual jealousy. And in these very chilling grown-up stories, she lets the knowledge out that she held back so carefully in her work for children. As I'll show you, all of these emotions that Alderman talks about certainly appear in Nesbit's writing, and perhaps her experience with adultery, unconventional marriages, and a very modern form of blended family influenced her writing and the way in which she presents relationships in her stories. However, like this reading by Lisa Scholl and Emily Morris from the Palgrave Encyclopedia of Victorian Women's Writing, I don't personally read her as a victim of her circumstances. Instead, as I've just suggested, I think there's something pretty modern in Nesbit's family style. While there's never been any real suggestion that she had any relationships with the other women involved, her willingness to bring them into her own family is, in my opinion, evocative of polyamory, with the Blands perhaps forming a proto-polycule. However, something a little bit less forward-thinking is Nesbit's attitude towards women, even given her status as one of the founding members of the Fabian Society, which is a precursor of our contemporary Labour Party. In Patricia Murphy's words, she was a paradoxical individual in her views about women, and even refused to support the cause of women's suffrage. She wrote sarcastically and disparagingly about suffragettes in some of her children's fiction. Victoria Margery goes further by noting that whilst from the outside, she lived a lifestyle that many would associate with the new woman by rejecting much of the Victorian ideological construct of femininity and embracing political, intellectual, and sexual freedoms. She cut her hair short. She was a heavy cigarette smoker. She rode bicycles, and she dressed in boyish woolen clothing. She expressly distanced herself from the political affiliations and demands of many new women writers. Even though her marriage was anything but conventional, some Nesbit biographers believe she cherished a more traditional relationship paradigm between men and women, and perhaps feared that tipping the political balance between the sexes would jeopardize this. However, I certainly believe that her own political views, as well as her experiences in life and in love, are reflected in her short Gothic stories. Victoria Margery has put it beautifully, discussing how the endings of Nesbit's stories are frequently brutal, tragic, and bleak, and refuse the happy endings that generic conventions compelled in her work in other genres, as well as showing that writing in the short supernatural form allowed Nesbit to eschew the marriage plot, as well as ripping out the heart of it and dancing on its grave, which I think is so beautifully put. Naomi Alderman observes that Nesbit's stories contain thwarted love, jealousy, vengeance, and the sense that even the best kind of love, the famous love that never falters, the love that pays the price, has something dark lurking within it. Margery also traces two main thematic clusters in her work, these being doomed or thwarted love, and death and horror at corpses. All of my 5 favourite stories fit in at least one of these themes, so a couple of them even fit in both. Let's get to it. My top 5 stories, beginning with Man Size in Marble, which is going to be televised this Christmas. And it's perhaps the most well-known of her short Gothic stories, and definitely the most frequently included in edited collections and most often reprinted. Scholl and Morris suggests that Man Size in Marble is a masterpiece of rural Gothic, exploiting very effectively its conceit of a young bourgeois hyper-metropolitan couple being wrong-footed by their move to an old-fashioned Kent village, the local superstitions belonging to which they ironize and fail to heed until it is too late. To give a brief summary, Man Size in Marble is the story of the narrator and his new wife, Laura, as they settle into a small house in the countryside near a medieval church. This church is home to a pair of marble statues of recumbent knights. These knights are the central figures in a local legend that states that they regularly get up from their slabs and walk around. They are warned by their new housekeeper, Mrs. Dorman, about these marble knights, and Laura herself begins to get some kind of presentiment that something's going to go wrong, but the narrator ignores this until it is too late and with tragic consequences. Something apparent within Man Size in Marble is the way in which Nesbit is critiquing the husband and his attitude towards his own marriage. Quite the opposite of her own husband, Laura's husband in the story seems to be a totally passive one. She's therefore contrasting the husband's apparent apathy towards his own marital duties and any physical forms of love or passion with the threat posed by the statues in the church. The couple are meant to be newlyweds, with all that implies, yet there's such a distinct lack of romance in their marriage that they seem to me more like a couple in the later years of marriage, where passion has dimmed and the relationship has developed into one closer to platonic than romantic. I do think this is purposeful by Nesbit. The only intimacy we see between the narrator and his wife is an abstract form of intimacy, with the narrator painting a portrait of her and working away with enthusiasm at her face with paints. In fact, we're told that the couple were looking for a cottage in the country that is at once sanitary and picturesque, because worrying about sanitation makes for the ideal romantic honeymoon. None of the houses they view are to standard, of course, and Nesbit seems to hint that the narrator's also finding fault with expected parts of the marital state itself. His complaint that if they found a vine or a rose-covered porch, corruption invariably lurked within, works as a sly metaphor for their own marriage. I think it's also noticeable that it's the husband here who seems to struggle the most with physical intimacy and, as I argue in my PhD thesis, seems to match up with modern ideas of asexuality, which is notable given the gendered nature of frigidity in the 19th century mind as a woman's condition. Perhaps the most damning detail of their marriage is the fact that The most exciting thing we're told about their 3 months of married happiness is that they did not have a single quarrel. Okay, this suggests marital bliss and a literal honeymoon phase, but it also hints at a total lack of passion. An aspect I really like about this story and why I think it's worth including on any top 5 is the fact that our narrator is such a strange example of masculinity throughout the story. He warns Laura at one point that if she cries, he shall have to cry too and render her unable to respect him again. Self-deprecating as this is, there's also an element of self-awareness here. And our unnamed narrator is contrasted wholly by the carved grey marble men lying in the church. It's ironic that literal statues, men that are carved from stone, seem more sexually virile than a living, breathing man of flesh and blood. In fact, the only moment in which the narrator and his wife show physical intimacy and share any kind of sexual passion is right at the climax of the story when the tension is at its highest. Importantly, this moment of intimacy is also initiated by Laura, not by the narrator. We're told that they sat looking at the fire in silence for some time before Laura at last sprang up, came behind him, and drawing his head back, kissed him. The inversion of power within their relationship, since the narrator is submissive and passive here, is absolutely illuminated. But it's him who ends this embrace and fatally leaves his wife alone and vulnerable. Laura attempts to stop him by flinging her arms around his neck and holding him very closely, but he merely strokes her hair and continues to leave for his nighttime walk. It soon becomes clear that this was a mistake, as the narrator begins to distinctly hear another step than his answer his like an echo as he walks through the countryside towards the church. When he sees that the church door's been left open, he can't help but be reminded of the legend of the 2 nights he had been told by Mrs. Dorman, as he remembered with a shiver of which he was ashamed. He could not do otherwise than walk up towards the altar just to look at the figures. But it's here that he realizes with horror that the legend of the walking statues is true. And this section is where Nesbit absolutely shines with her power for horrifying and deliciously creepy description coming into full force. She describes the narrator as stopping short, with his heart giving a great leap that nearly choked him, and then sickeningly sinking again as he realizes that the statues are gone. Then we're told of the horror indefinable and indescribable that he feels as he is seized by an overwhelming certainty of supreme and accomplished calamity. Laura is discovered back at the cottage, fallen back against a table in the window, and her body lay half on it and half on the window seat, and her head hung down over the table, the brown hair loosened and fallen to the carpet. The connotations implied by the positioning of her body, especially coupled with the loose hair, are that Laura has been assaulted by the marble statues and as a consequence has died. This is supported by the fact that she's also found with hands tightly clenched and a grey marble finger inside. Nesbit makes it clear that this is the narrator's fault, because we're told that in between discovering the statues missing and finding of Laura's body, he had been convinced to take one more look and discover the statues back in their rightful place. However, one of them was seen to have a broken hand with a finger missing. We'll move on to our next one, the ebony frame, which is in complete contrast to the lack of passion and romance displayed in Man's Size in Marble. The ebony frame is a story with witchcraft and a doomed eternal love at its core. Again, to summarize, this story follows a young man who inherits a country house from his recently deceased aunt, where he plans to host his soon-to-be fiancée and her mother. Whilst exploring his new property, the young man finds an otherworldly ebony frame and 2 portraits, one that looks just like him, and another featuring a darkly beautiful woman that instantly captures his heart. The tale ends with their love, a romance that tried to outlast eternity, doomed, like so many of Nesbit's romances. Again, what I love about this story is the description. It's not quite a modern horror, but it's equal parts eerie and tragic. This young man is a much more full-blooded example than the narrator of Man's Size. However, what I think is notable is the fact that just like her own husband, Nesbit's young man seems to be disloyal in terms of love. His legacy, knowing that he's going to inherit all of this money and this estate, has already almost put Mildred out of his head. So it's no surprise that his head is so easily turned by a painting. The frame he finds at first appears to have nothing in it, and he notes that there's no subject and no colour was distinguishable. But there was a splodge of darker tint in the middle, and seeing this, something takes over him, and he finds himself tearing off leather bindings and discovering two pictures that had been nailed face to face. There's something occult and ritualistic about this description, which is only amplified when he realizes that one of the pictures seemed a perfect portrait of himself, with no shade of expression or turn of feature wanting. However, the mystery of when or where this apparent portrait of him in costume was painted is banished from his mind when he sees the figure in the other painting and is so taken with her that it was a quarter of an hour before he could turn his eyes away from her. Interestingly, he uses a turn of phrase here that's prophetic when he thinks about how his portrait had so long lived face to face with this beautiful witch, and also how his gaze was held fixed as by a strong magic. Because, as it soon becomes apparent, the inhabitant of this painting was indeed a witch, and had also been tried as one. Looking at her portrait, he summons her, holding out his arms and declaring, "Oh, how I wish you were a woman and not a picture. Come down." As befits a horror story, Nesbit informs us that although the corners of the room were deeply shadowed, there was also something darker than a shadow in the room. And when the narrator notices this, he's absolutely taken with fear. "I hope I shall never again know a moment of terror so blank and absolute. I could have not moved or spoken to save my life," he says. But at the touch of this mysterious, shadowy woman's hand, everything changes. And he says, "I hardly know to express it, but at once it seemed not awful, not even unusual, for portraits to become flesh, only most natural, most right, most unspeakably fortunate." And with a passionate cry, a sense of having suddenly recovered life's one great good that had seemed wholly lost, he clasps her in his arms. From this moment on, there's some kind of weird blurring between dream and reality, and this whole one night seems to take up the rest of this young man's life. He sees that there's a sense of glad reunion, the complete realization of every hope and dream of a life, and everything else becomes the dream. He doesn't think of Mildred. He doesn't think of anything else except being there with this woman that has come down from the painting. And he knows that he has known her in a previous life, but can't remember her and can't remember why, can only remember that he loves her. And the story unfolds. They were indeed engaged to be married hundreds of years ago, but as he went away to make arrangements in his own country, they tried her as a witch and said that she should be burned. Ironically, at this point, she was not a witch. She was, as was the case with so many young women at that time, clever, learned. She knew science, she knew mathematics, she probably knew astronomy. But here is a delicious twist. The night before she is tried and burnt at the stake, the devil came and she sold her soul to eternal flame. But, she says, she got a good price. "I got the right to come back," she said, "through my picture if anyone looking at it wished for me, as long as my picture stayed in its ebony frame, which," she says, "was not carved by a man's hand." Nesbit puts a bit of description here that I think is very evocative and foreshadows the ending of this story, as she describes how they burnt her for a witch. "They made me suffer hell on earth, those faces, all crowding round the crackling wood and the smell of the smoke." It's then that she reveals the other price she paid for her soul. If her young lover will also give up his hopes of heaven, then she will be able to return to life completely, move in his world, and be his wife. This doesn't sound like much of an ask for the young man, because he declares that it's a contradiction in terms, because she is his soul. They agree then that he will return at midnight the next night, where they will take each other as husband and wife, and she will be returned to the land of the living. He goes back to his room, falls into a deep sleep, and wakes the next day with the horrifying, shocking remembrance of Mildred, his soon-to-be fiancée, and her mother coming for lunch any moment then. He decides that the only way he can get through this is by moving the frame with his portrait of his beloved into the parlor so that he can look at it and This is how he gets through an incredibly awkward meeting. I looked up at my sweetheart in the ebony frame, and I felt that anything that might happen, any irresponsible imbecility, any bathos of boredom, was nothing if, after all, she came to me again. What's ironic is that irresponsible imbecility, that bathos of boredom, he's talking about Mildred, the woman that not 24 hours ago he was intending to marry. And in fact, he describes her as poor little Mildred, sitting there smiling, serene in her confidence that her every word charmed me. And now even her laugh sets every nerve in his body vibrating with annoyance. A horrible sense of the reality of Mildred comes upon him, and he can't do anything but excuse himself, remove himself from the room, and wander in the countryside until late at night. The bell strikes 11 and he decides to return, to head back up to his beloved and be reunited with her, except his house is on fire. And all he can think about is saving the painting and the lady within it. He doesn't even notice Mildred in an upstairs window crying for help. And so he goes on up the stairs, cracking, smoking, hot as hell, to the room where her picture was. Instead, he finds Mildred and saves her with a strange unease. Because now he has realized the whole horror of the situation. As long as my picture remains in the ebony frame, his lady had said. But what if picture and frame perish together? This is where the tragedy comes, and that premonition that we had before when she described her mortal death comes back again in a tragic echo. He sees her lady through the smoke and the flames, holding out her arms to him, who came too late to save her and to save his own life's joy. He never sees her again, and he is plunged into his own form of hell as he feels the floor yield beneath his feet, and he is plunged into the flames of the inferno below. From then on, he lives a kind of half-life. He marries Mildred, they have a family, but as far as he's concerned, the waking world, that reality, that's the dream. His real life is in that one moment, that one night he spent in the company of his beloved. A kind of similar story on a similar vein, in which love seems to transcend the boundaries of death, is John Charrington's Wedding. I love this story. It's quite funny at the beginning. There's a real sort of ironic and sarcastic humor that bleeds through, but there's also a really creepy ending, and there's a build-up and constant suggestion and foreshadowing woven by Nesbit throughout the entirety of the story. So to summarize John Charrington's Wedding, John Charrington is in love with the most beautiful girl in the village, along with apparently everybody else. John repeatedly asks her to marry him and is refused, and asks again and is refused, but his perseverance pays off and they set a date for their wedding. But just before they can get married, John's wealthy relative, of whom he is the heir, summons him to his presence. John promises his bride-to-be that nothing would stop him returning to marry her. And it turns out that that is very true. The very first line of this story is quite funny, in my opinion. No one ever thought that May Foster would marry John Charrington, but he thought differently, and things which John Charrington intended should happen had a way of happening. He was not the only man who wants to marry May Foster, Nesbit tells us. She was the belle of our village, and everyone was in love with her, more or less. She even says that it was a sort of fashion to be in love with May Foster, like heliotrope ties or Inverness capes. Everyone else kind of in love with May because she's beautiful and it's the thing to do, whereas John Charrington, the suggestion is truly in love with her. And it is a very big surprise to everybody when he arrives in the pub and declares, "I'm sorry to deprive you fellows of your only joke, but Miss Foster and I are to be married in September." No one can believe this because May Foster has never given any hint that she returns John Charrington's affections. And in fact, they joke with him about it. "Charrington has bewitched the only pretty girl in our 20-mile radius. Was it mesmerism or a love potion, Jack?" In fact, they go and they congratulate her to see what her reaction is, but they're surprised because when they congratulate her, she blushes and smiles and dimples for all the world as though she were in love with him and had been in love with him all the time. In fact, our narrator is so concerned with does she actually care for John Charrington that he accidentally stumbles upon them having a romantic tryst in the graveyard. And here, well, he sees her face turn towards the full splendor of the setting sun, and its expression ended at once and forever any question of love for him. It's here that we have that first real strong foreshadowing of what might be happening at the end of the story. As John declares, "My dear, I believe I should come back from the dead if you wanted me." Before their wedding, Mr. Brambridge, John's rich relative, sends a message that he is dying and wishes to see John. When John's leaving on the train, May begs with him not to go. "I feel certain something will happen," she says. All John can reply is, "Do you think I should let anything happen to keep me? And the day after tomorrow, our wedding day? Nothing shall keep me." When he is asked, what if Mr. Brambridge dies, he replies, "Alive or dead, I mean to be married on Thursday." Obviously, what he means is whether or not Mr. Brambridge dies, he is going to be back here so that he doesn't miss his own wedding. But again, that's another part of foreshadowing for what might happen. Our narrator, for whatever reason, is designated to be the person to go and collect John when his train comes in at 3 o'clock sharp and deliver him straight to the church for their wedding. But he arrives at 3:30, very annoyed with John, because to him it seemed a sort of slight to the beautiful girl who loved him that he should come, as it were, out of breath and with the dust of travel upon him, to take her hand, which some of us would have given the best years of our lives to take. But the 3 o'clock train comes into the station and John does not get off. "What a fool to miss that first train," our narrator says. But then John doesn't arrive on the next train. And when he doesn't show, our narrator suddenly feels that something awful must have happened to him. And he is going to be the one to tell the bride. It's 5 minutes to 4 as he draws up at the churchyard, and Edith Nesbit is very, very, very takes great pains to remind us of what timings are at this part of the story. The time that everything happens is very important. So 5 minutes to 4, he arrives at the wedding, sees the gardener outside, and asks, "Oh, is everyone still in the chapel? Have they left yet?" The gardener is slightly confused and says, "Well, actually, John Carpenter, he arrived just before you did, but something very strange about him," the gardener says. "I didn't like the looks of him at all, and the folks inside are saying all sorts of things. You'll see something's very wrong with Mr. John, and he's tried liquor. He looked like a ghost." And indeed, Byles the gardener is right. When the bridal party proceed out of the chapel, the narrator can see that John does not look like himself. There was dust on his coat, his hair was disarranged, he seemed to have been in some row, for there was a black mark above his eyebrow, and he is deathly pale. A really, really deliciously creepy detail is that as they pass out the chapel, the bell ringers stopped, and then on the ears expecting the gay wedding peal came the slow tolling of the passing bell. To this funereal dirge, the bride shudders, and grey shadows came about her mouth. The ringers are urged to remedy their mistake, but they protest with many whispered expletives that they had not rung that bell. The funeral peal, that tolling of the funeral bell, rang itself. In a hush, like the hush in a chamber of death, the bridal pair pass into their carriage. But when they reach their destination, there is no sign of John Charrington, and of May, his wife, only a huddled heap of white satin lying half on the floor of the carriage and half on the seat. We're told that her face is white, and drawn with agony and horror, bearing such a look of terror as I have never seen since, except in dreams. And her hair, her radiant blonde hair, I tell you it was white like snow. Now, critics have characterized this as an abduction, a dead man abducting his wife. Instead, I think it's more a husband fulfilling his promise to his wife, because it's at this point that a telegraph arrives. John Charrington was thrown from the dog cart on his way to the station at 1:30 and killed on the spot. And all our narrator can think is remembering John's promise, "I shall be married on Thursday, dead or alive." And now we move on to the pavilion. Now, Victoria Margery has spoken about the pavilion as being about the theme of women's social marginality, which is given quite explicit treatment, although it is distant from the present day by the story setting in the past. She continues to suggest that at a deeper level, the pavilion pulsates with anger at a culture that values women primarily as adornments, circumscribes their fields of action, and discounts women of intelligence and acuity. And this message remains relevant for Nesbit's contemporary audience, as perhaps it does for readers of her fiction today. My reading of this story is quite similar. I think that this is one of the most explicit stories in which Nesbit champions the role of the unmarried woman and perhaps the scorned woman. To summarize, plain Jane Amelia, constantly overshadowed by her beautiful cousin Ernestine, has to watch as two men, Thesiger and Frederick, both in love with Ernestine, dare each other to stay the night in an ominous vine-covered pavilion, the apparent site of numerous deaths, in order to prove themselves a worthy suitor. But tragedy befalls them. Interestingly, and I'm sorry to spoil it, this is another story that isn't really a ghost story. Instead, it features a vampiric man-eating plant, a motif that is found in a number of Victorian and fin de siècle Gothic stories. I think the pavilion is actually a story in which the only ghostly character is Amelia. She's made invisible and ghostly by being pushed to the side, literally by the plot and also by the other characters. This means that Amelia is able to quietly observe and participate in the story spectrally. Nesbit describes Amelia as one of those featureless blondes who seem born to be overlooked. She's very nearly plain and also aware of her own homeliness as she keeps her beautiful hands and ears out of sight as much as possible in order to cement her status as unattractive and uninteresting. I think it's really interesting that this gives Amelia's character a sense of ownership towards her plainness. The suggestion here is that she could flaunt her beautiful features, but she instead chooses to hide them and cement herself as not the special interest of anyone. She's aware of her unattractiveness. She's aware that everybody overlooks her, and she embraces this and accepts this as her identity. Doing so allows her as a character to exist on the margins of society, which, by extension, ironically places her as the center of the narrative, as she becomes the eye through which the reader watches the story unfold. This invisibility or forced spectatorship is really evident during the moments in which Amelia is shown amongst her friends and peers, particularly in the contrast between Ernestine and Amelia. The male characters do their best to seat themselves around Ernestine, whether it never seemed to matter whom Amelia sat beside. Similarly, it's an attempt to impress Ernestine with their machismo that triggers the supernatural events at the core of the story. Amelia, the spectator at the sidelines, seems to be the only character aware of any real danger to be found in the pavilion. Thesiger and Frederick dare each other to spend the night within the pavilion, the site of not exactly a ghost story where everyone who has slept within it has died. This has been the case since it was first built by an alchemist or astrologer, where his friend slept overnight and was found dead from blood loss the next morning. So whilst Thesiger and Frederick are egging each other on and daring each other to spend a night in the pavilion, Amelia tries to dissuade them, but of course no one pays any attention to her plea. Nesbit's throwaway phrase, "of course," here re-emphasizes Amelia's peripherality by suggesting that it's obvious that she's going to be ignored. She further foregrounds Amelia's impending spinsterdom with the contrast between her character and Ernestine, as well as through making Amelia aware of her own powerlessness compared to Ernestine. Once Thesiger and Frederick have made their plans, Amelia pleads with her cousin to stop them, showing that she's aware of her own status among the men. When Amelia notes that the men would mind if Ernestine asked them not to sleep in that hateful pavilion, it shows that she's aware, along with us, the reader, that Ernestine is the more eligible and attractive of the two. This is further exaggerated by Nesbit when she uses the language of ghostliness to describe Amelia's appearance as a white apparition still in evening dress. The true tragedy of the pavilion is the fact that the only intimacy Amelia is able to access happens after her love interest, which to this point we, the reader, hadn't even known about, has died as a result of his time in the pavilion. Amelia has been quietly in love with Thesiger this entire time, but she can't act on it until Thesiger has died. It turns out Thesiger was aware of the real nature of the plant in the pavilion, and his intention in daring Frederick to spend the night there was to quite literally get him out of the way. Nesbit's way with tragic, evocative description comes through here again. We see the image of a living woman on whose warm breast his cold and heavy head lay pillowed. This image is particularly intimate and sensual. Were Thesiger still alive, it would veer into the erotic, the man resting on the breast of his lover. However, his death renders this tragic, and another reminder that this is a level of physical intimacy that Amelia will forever be excluded from. Furthermore, the little white wounds, like little bloodless lips half open, that are around Thesiger's neck create a mocking image of sexuality and sexual intimacy that further highlights Amelia's non-sexual impending spinsterdom, especially in Nesbit's creation of that imagery of half-open lips. The supernatural hematophagic plant is able to caress and kiss Thesiger's neck, drawing blood in an act of eroticism, but all Amelia can do is cradle his corpse. After this, Nesbit subtly informs the reader that Amelia returned to her invisible position and does indeed fully develop from proto to fully fledged spinster, in comparison to Ernestine, who survives her beloved and surrounded by children and grandchildren. The use of the word beloved here seems to be emphatically reminding us of Amelia's solitary spinster life, further illuminated where Ernestine eulogizes her friend as poor Amelia, who nobody ever looked the same side of the road where she was. Finally, and my favourite, which I've saved for last, From the Dead is a story about an unfaithful husband. He might not commit adultery physically, but Arthur, the protagonist, rejects his wife in a moment of anger. He seems to be an inconstant lover from the start. To summarize, it's a bit like a soap opera. At the beginning of the story, Arthur is engaged to Elvira. However, he is handed a note by Ida, which is claimed to be from Elvira, and expresses her love for Ida's brother. This puts a knife in Arthur's heart, but eventually Arthur realizes that actually he loves Ida after all, and they eventually marry. However, only 3 weeks after their wedding, Ida confesses to Arthur because she cannot hide anything now from him because he is hers, body, soul, and spirit, that she had written the letter all along. Arthur is enraged and leaves, only to return a few hours later to either beg her forgiveness or forgive her, whichever happens first. But Ida's not there, and Arthur does not hear from her until he is told that she is pregnant and dying. Not to spoiler too much, but this story also sees the stereotypical Victorian image of the bride lying on the marital bed and terrified of her approaching groom, reversed and perverted. The story's unique and radical atmosphere of sex repulsion problematizes established concepts of male sexuality and masculine prowess in its inversion of the female sexual terror trope. Not only this, but the physicality, the tangibility of the ghost at the heart of this story further injects an element of real danger. The ghost is not a spirit, it's a revenant, the corpse returned to life to seek retribution, in a juxtaposition of passive femininity and a violent interruption of the dead upon the living. From the outset, Nesbit hits that the relationship between Arthur and his wife Ida is shallow and unhealthy. On receiving the letter that seems to reveal that his current fiancée Elvira is in fact in love with the brother of Ida, his reaction causes her to rise suddenly, very pale and her eyes haggard. This foreshadows the eventual transformation of Ida into undead bride at the climax of the story, and hints at the danger of Arthur and Ida's relationship. Moreover, Arthur observes that there was a softness in Ida's tone that irritated and stimulated him. It's strange but notable that Arthur speaks of the woman he will marry and is, one can assume, attracted to as both irritating and stimulating. Yet Arthur himself behaves monstrously towards Ida after he releases Elvira from their engagement and marries her instead. Ida, Nesbit takes pain to emphasize, is devoted to Arthur and loves him to the point of utter adoration. And that level of love leads her to confess that the letter had in fact been a forgery of her own doing. This confession enrages Arthur, who feels that at that moment she was no longer the wife I adored, she was only a woman who had forged a letter and tricked me into marrying her. But at least internally, Arthur quickly regains his composure and realizes how much his wife does love him. In another perversion of the honesty and faithfulness promised by the marriage state, Arthur seems to relish that Ida loves him more than faith and fair dealing and all the traditions of honesty and honour. Yet, even though he doesn't mean a word of it, Arthur rejects Ida and ends their marriage in a bizarre and grotesque power play where he did not even know whether he expected her to creep to his knees and implore forgiveness. These issues of honesty and of fidelity are echoed later in the story, when Arthur first sees his wife's corpse, when Nesbit mentions the smell of lavender, camphor, and narcissus emanating from the room. Whilst camphor was used in Victorian funerary practices because of its antifungal properties, both lavender, distrust, and narcissus, egotism and unequaled love, have significance in the Victorian language of flowers. The distrust between both Arthur and Ida, as well as the double meaning of the Narcissus, echoing Arthur's egotism and Ida's unequaled love, perhaps, reflect the true nature of Arthur's regard for his late wife. Ida herself was secretive. We learn from the woman that takes her in before she dies that she was that ashamed of Arthur she never so much as told she was married. Yet she also claims that Ida loved the ground Arthur walked on, so the shame might have been an echo of the shame she felt for lying to him. The marriage, thanks perhaps to the layers of dishonesty, withheld information, and its fraudulent beginnings, seem to this point to be a one-sided and wholly non-sexual affair, but we do learn that Ida has borne Arthur a child before dying, and therefore their marriage was at least consummated. The passion Arthur saw in the original letter forged by Ida, the passion that had been new to him, seems to only exist in the abstract, on paper but not in practice, and always hidden from view. Arthur's air of bridal virginity is therefore carried over into her death. The bed her body lays in is covered with white, a colour as associated with death as it is with marriage and the bride. She's described as beautiful in death, yet when Arthur kisses her lips, the first instance of physical affection we've seen from him throughout the whole story, her lips are like marble, and unlike the fairy tale princess, she did not waken and will not waken now ever again. When Arthur leaves her to sleep in a bed, the counterpart of this in a room next door, it's a macabre parody of the bride and groom sleeping separately before their wedding. He's acutely aware of the dead woman in the next room. The sense of creeping dread that begins to build when Arthur becomes aware of a slight sound that was not the ticking of a clock coming from the room where the corpse lay is intensified by Nesbit as she continues to describe Arthur's sense of panic mingling with his guilt. His fear for what he is hearing and what he might witness causes him to feel an even more intense sense of self-loathing, as he observes that it meant that I, having killed my wife as surely as though I had put a knife in her breast, had now sunk so low as to be afraid of her dead body. Again, as he had at the beginning of the story, Arthur speaks hollow words opposite to his true feelings. He forces himself to say out loud that he wishes she would come, while every fibre of his body and mind shrank and quivered in denial. The image of Arthur shrinking and quivering in his bed in anticipation of his late wife entering the room is a direct inversion of this terrified bride trope. Arthur is lying in bed, thinking of England, if you will. He continues to wait, sick with terror and clenching the sheet in his hands as he listens to the sound of slow steps in the passage, slow, heavy steps. Finally, the door opens, slowly, 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 and the figure of Arthur's dead wife came into the room. Nesbit's repetition of the word slowly during this passage rhythmically echoes the sound of a heartbeat, and we begin to anticipate the climax of the tale, the final confrontation between husband and dead wife, as much as Arthur does. When Ida the corpse finally enters, she's a ghastly, morbid echo of Ida the bride. Dressed in white grave clothes with the white bandage under its chin, the corpse connotes the bride in her white wedding clothes and veil. She again references the scent of lavender and camphor and white narcissus, the whiteness of the narcissus connoting peace and purity, alongside the funeral applications of the flowers and the previously established themes of unequaled love. And indeed, Arthur observes that the corpse was looking at him with love unspeakable. Ida, the faithful bride, is now an it, devoid of her femininity and even her humanity. At the sight of his bride returned, approaching his bed, Arthur is paralyzed with abject terror. The corpse that was Ida questions Arthur in a manner that seems both playful and coquettish, while at the same time repulsive, each time repeating the phrase, "Now I am dead." The juxtaposition between the playful flirting and asking if Arthur will love again now that Ida is dead, and the horror of her literally being dead, emphasizes the tense sexual repulsion felt by Arthur in this scene, and also highlights again the inversion at play here. Arthur is in place of the woman, shrieking aloud as her husband comes to her bed at night, whose reaction to Ida coming to kiss him is to cover his face with all his force. Yet, unlike the husband, who we can imagine would continue to approach his cowering bride in order to forcibly exert his marital right upon her, Ida the corpse turns and quickly leaves the room, crumpling to the floor in the corridor outside, once again quite still and dead, before Arthur can change his mind and follow her. So why do I love Edith Nesbit, and why should you too? Well, to go back to Naomi Alderman, Nesbit's stories for children are always prefigured by adult sadness. It's just that she never made the children look in that direction. But we can see that sadness and that darkness in these adult stories. They're deliciously described and full of genuine moments of terror, of eeriness, of tragedy, and of a romantic kind of doomed love. Very evocative, I think, of the woman Nesbit must have been. I don't tend to subscribe to psychoanalysis or authorial biography too much. If you've ever listened to my other talks or read any of my work, I make this quite plain. But I think it's undeniable to do so here. The female rage bubbling under the surface of her writing makes Nesbit, in my opinion, one of the best of the Victorian weird and Gothic writers. And I'm glad she's finally having her moment. Thank you.